Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to my lecture on designing the user interface. This is a lecture for my systems analysis class. And designing the user interface is essentially a skill that we use in putting together the proposed solution document for our project. And the proposed solution document in in the current incarnation of the course in the current semester, and this has been stable for a while. But you're asked to create four uh, mock-ups of system inputs or system outputs, and in a lot of times these days we have the same screen that's acting as both an input and an output. So it's hard to characterize it as an input or an output, but an input output. But four different views you're going to be creating. And what we want you to do is to um, take um, take requirements from the systems analysis document that you've done, and we're going to want you to bring them alive in a concrete way in these designs you're doing for the inputs and the outputs. Okay, and the idea here is that simply the diagrams and the other documents that we've done so far, they've done a good job of enumerating the requirements, but it's sometimes hard for the users to envision, well, what would that look like in a system that either we would buy or would be built for us. And so here we're giving them just a glimpse, just four little snapshots of what this application might look like. Okay? Uh, so, um, a couple things. One is that we want these example inputs or outputs or input outputs that we have to illustrate um, some of the use cases that we've described in our systems analysis document. So they basically ought to agree. Okay? Now, in the systems analysis document, I think we only do three use case specifications, and we're doing four of these. Now, they don't have to match up, okay? So they just have to be four snapshots of the user interface at some point during the use cases. Okay, and typically we're not looking for the administrative use cases like authorize user or login. We're looking for the business use cases like you know, withdraw cash or make deposit, those kinds of things, right? So that's what we're trying to do. That's what the end activity is. So the lecture that goes along with this is we're covering two of the chapters from the Hoffer text, chapter 10 and chapter 11. And I'm going to cover them fairly quickly, not in super depth, um, because you know a lot of this. Okay, the other courses that you're taking about web design and web application design and implementation, all these kind of things, we cover a lot of these principles. So, to the extent that we should know these things already, I'll point that out. To the extent that the authors have a little bit of a different point of view, because I think they do, sometimes I think that has a lot of value, and I'll try to point that out. So let's go take a look at chapter 10. So, chapter 10 is about designing forms and reports. And in systems historically, forms and reports are different things. So, if you go back to the days when I got into IT, which is 40 years ago, um, we had batch application systems, so we didn't have online systems. So users put their data onto coding forms. So they would be typically pre-printed pieces of paper where you wrote in your name and you wrote in your address and all those kinds of things. And we still see those kind of forms today where we see the little boxes around, the letters that go into your name. They try to coach you to not give them more data than they're going to record within the database and that kind of stuff. So we're talking about those kind of forms. Um, and of course, the output that we got back in the good old days was not coming out on a screen. It was coming out on a printed paper report. And of course, we still have a lot of those. We print a lot of reports off of laser printers and such. So there was a clear distinction back in the good old days when Hoffer was a boy and I was a boy between inputs and outputs. Okay, the inputs were the forms, the outputs were the reports. In online systems, and particularly in the kind of systems that we work with today, um, we're more likely to have some kind of a view that we're working with that has some kind of input output, some kind of input aspects and some kind of output aspects. Um, Very often, when we're working with a web application, we can display the data on a page, and then if we want to change it, we can change it right there on that page, and then we can press an OK button or a submit button. So something is both an input and an output. Okay, so for those things and the kind of tips and tricks that come from the authors here, well then some of the insights that they have about inputs would apply, and some of the insights that they have about outputs would apply. But I just want to point out that I'm well aware that the distinction between the two has gotten quite hazy. All right, and that's okay. You can design things that aren't all input or all output. I want you to design things that are kind of in keeping with the design ethos of today. All right, let's look down through chapter 10, the kind of stuff that they like to talk about. Again, this is part of design. What we're doing here is preliminary design, okay? Because it gives the stakeholders a greater tangible feel for what we're talking about. Okay, they're usually pretty tangible people, so the the diagrams and the lists of requirements and all that we create in the systems analysis, you can get them to read those and you can get them to help you get them right. If you really want to get them excited, you've got to say, here's what it would look like in a system that's built. Okay? So, in terms of a form is any business document that contains some predefined data that may include some areas where additional data are to be filled in. An instance of a form is typically based on one database record. Well, that's usually true. Um, so I described what I meant by paper forms, but we're pretty used to forms in the current world. We're used to web forms, right? So we're used to seeing a web page that has a lot of boxes on it that we're able to type into. They might be populated when we first see it and we have a chance to change it or not. They might be empty. They might be populated um, in more recent technologies. We might have some kind of a grayed out sample input in there that we can see. Okay, so that's what forms look like today. They're not the paper forms. And reports, Typically these days we expect to get our output on a browser. We typically want to see a web page, and then we typically can optionally print those. So the difference between a browser page output and a printed output is it's not a big distinction. When we print them out, we want to see things like page numbers and maybe grand totals and that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, the differences between a printed report and a a report that comes out as a web page is just one of what the physical medium is. Okay. Here's an insight that the authors have you don't always see. Um, they're saying you as a systems analyst should think about the range of the kind of reports that you can have. So they talk about scheduled reports, key indicator reports, exception reports, drill down reports, ad hoc reports. If you think about systems that you've used, a lot of the reports are going to fall into these categories. So the schedule ones are produced at predefined time intervals for routine information needs. Okay. Now, they're not as popular as they once were because people expect to get most of their information from screens. So they're more likely these days to expect the screen to, when they go to the browser and they bring up the report that they want, they have some expectation of how current it will be. You know, they may see the data that's up to the minute. They may see data that is from the end of last week. They may see data that's from the end of last night. So, scheduled printed reports have largely been replaced by expectations about how current screens of data are going to be that appear in your browser. Key indicator reports provides a summary of critical information on a regular basis. Again, this is the idea that maybe you don't have to look at all the data in the system. Maybe there are some things that are key indicators of how well things are going in the business, and you can just look at a very important subset. Exception reports. Again, this was especially important when we had printed reports. Okay. Um, when you printed out all the data that was in the system on a fairly regular basis, well, it was easy for things that were out of kilter to get overlooked. Exception reports or screens would just highlight the things that are out of uh, normal operating parameters. Drill down is something that works really well on the web. Okay. Um, let's say that we're looking at sales. Okay. And what we might do is we might begin by looking at sales for the whole organization. And then we might click, and then we would see it broken down by geographic region. And then we'd click on a region, and then we might see a breakdown by subregion. And then we click on a subregion, and we might see it broken down by individual stores. So this drilling down to just the level of information that you need has been very popular for a long time, and it lends itself to web applications. Ad hoc responds to unplanned requests for non-routine information needs. Um, this has to do with the fact that when we build a system, we're not going to be able to anticipate all the information needs. Now, a lot of ad hoc reporting has been delegated to um, the data warehouse. Okay, so because the information from operational systems is regularly extracted and populated into the data warehouse, a lot of time ad hoc reports are created by running queries in the data warehouse. Um, so because this is a very user-centered activity, this is a place where the authors are saying that some kind of prototyping would work well. Okay, and I agree. All right, so either real prototyping or kind of paper prototyping, but the idea is that um, you do some design and then you show that to the user. Okay, if you were doing, I guess, real prototyping, instead of showing some kind of a mock-up, you'd be showing some kind of uh, running a prototype. Okay, but we come up with an approximation of what we think the inputs and the outputs should be, and then we show them to people. And then we kind of walk through them. Okay, you'd be doing such and such an activity, and then you'd be here. Okay, what do you think about how this works? All right, and then we get their feedback and we adjust. All right, that's why these 4 samples that I want you to create that are part of your proposed solution should represent just a snapshot of one of the use cases, right? Because you want to be able to say, here, you're in such and such a use case, here's what's going on, and here's what your options are. Here's where you are within the use case, and this is what the experience looks like. Okay, so again, they could be part of a prototyping approach. You might show that to a user, and they would say, "Oh no, it wouldn't look like that because you forget that all all A's are B's and all C's are 24s." And you go, "Oh yeah, that's right. It wouldn't look like that." And you go back and you change it. Okay, so whether we're building working prototypes or we're just mocking up what things would look like, this kind of iterative approach where we try to show them snapshots of what it's going to look like and get their feedback is very prototyping oriented. Now, this part of the chapter, I think, is a bit old-fashioned. The one on slide 9, where they say requirements determination. Who will use the form or report? What's the purpose of the form or report? Blah, 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 blah. And this really goes back to old school systems analysis and design. What we used to do in the old days is we would say, okay, we have to have some reports. Okay, well, what kind of reports are we going to have? Well, and we're going to have some forms for inputs, and we say, well, what are we going to have? Well, we wouldn't be talking about them as part of a use case. Okay, so the extent that we're talking about inputs, outputs, or hybrid input outputs here, we're going to be talking about them in terms of a use case that's going on. So we're not going to have to speculate, well, who might use this report? Well, we're going to design something for that use case. Okay? So a lot of the questions you see on slide 9, they're going to be answered because we're going to be designing something specifically for a particular use case scenario. Okay? And we won't have all this wide open thinking that you see on slide 9. All right? Which, in fact, that kind of thinking led to a lot of reports and screens that were never used. Why weren't they used? Because they really weren't part of a real use case. They were part of what some designer or programmer thought that somebody might want to ask. Nobody ever went back to the users and said, are you going to use this when you do your job? They probably would have been told, oh, hell no, we're not going to use that. We don't need to see that. We'll look at something else. So the questions on slide 9 are really too old school for you. Prototyping, I think you guys understand, right? We have a set of requirements and we try to come up with something that will fill them, and then we show that to people and we get some feedback, and then we improve it, and then we improve it and improve it, and then at a certain point we go, okay, we're close enough for now. Okay, prototyping. Okay, you can do it with real computing products, okay, in which you're kind of building the real thing. Or you can simply do it with mock-up tools. I'm going to recommend that for our course you use mock-up tools. All right. Here are a couple of things that were used historically to mock things up. Okay. This takes me way back here on slide 12. Back in the old days, we used to have, at least in the IBM mainframe world, we used to have 132 column printers. And we had printer layout charts that looked like this, but they kept going off to the right to all the way to 132. And typically you'd have something like 66 lines on a page. So you'd have about 66 lines on the form. And you would draw, you could write on the form in pencil or pen if you were brave, what the report was going to look like. So that's how you marked it up. You marked it up by hand. Now, in later years, we began to do the same kind of thing by using some kind of a text editor. All right. Something that I do a lot of now, and I think my students have had quite a bit of success with, is just using HTML and CSS to mock up the inputs and the outputs that you're going to have. Right? So create an HTML page, create simple styling with CSS. If it's an input form, use a web form. And you don't have to worry about some kind of a pencil-based form like this when we know HTML and CSS. So without any really specialized mocking up tools, we can do even better than we see here on slide 12. This on slide 13 is it's a Visual Basic panel. Okay, so it's a graphical user interface. If it's running in Visual Basic, it's probably part of a two-tier client-server approach. Okay, so it's a little bit old school. All right, and what they would do is that sometimes they just would do the design of the screen with the eventual tools like Visual Basic, and they just wouldn't write all the code behind it. Okay, so that's a kind of prototyping that people did. Okay, now we're probably not going to be using this kind of approach in our projects because we're probably not going to be writing an oldish school two-tier client-server approach. We're probably going to have a three-tiered client-server approach where the client is using the browser. If we're going to have a layout of a screen like this, it's probably going to be for a mobile device. Okay. Okay, if we're doing a full design, which we in the class are not, we're doing a very abbreviated design. We're doing one section to talk about the architecture, another section to show 4 samples of inputs and outputs. Well, then, if you were doing a design, you would have a design document that would have a whole lot of uh, specifications. Well, we're not going quite that far. Okay, we're doing a preliminary design. Uh, they have some information here about what would be in a design specification for a program. Um, these kinds of design specifications are maybe geared towards programming before object-oriented tools. Um, but we'll see. Now, here we have some tips about forms and reports. This is clear usability stuff. We need meaningful titles. Um, we want to have meaningful information with no extraneous information. This is all stuff that we've learned at SOAS. We'd like the layout to be visually balanced. If there's going to be navigation, we want navigation from screen to screen, or from web page to web page to be well thought out, easy to understand, uh, easy to do physically. Um, there's a lot of tips in the chapter on just really basic typography and layout. So here on Slate 18 is a version of a screen that the authors don't like. Okay, the title's vague. It's difficult to read the information. It's packed too tightly. There's no navigation information. There's no summary of account activity. And then you get down to number 19, and they've solved all those problems, right? Now, would we solve them exactly this way if this were a web page? Well, that would probably look a little different. Okay, but we use the same principles. And this is pretty well consistent with this, the kind of things that you've been taught in SOAS about um, how to design web pages and web forms. All right. Um, so the kinds of things that we might want to do is notify users of errors by highlighting, providing warnings by highlighting, draw attention to keywords or commands. So we want to use all the visual tools, and we want to use them in a useful way and not an annoying way. Now, here on 21, they talk about what you could do to highlight information, and they talk about some good stuff, some good typography stuff, but they also, for instance, they talk about blinking. Okay. Um, some people believe or believed that blinking things on the screen could trigger seizures in people prone to seizures. Um, I don't know if people still believe that to be true, but it's still something that I worry about. Blinking text is very annoying. Um, I did have a group of developers in one of my classes at the state of Illinois who worked for the taxation department, and they had something for their people who deal with taxpayers, and if the taxpayers owed, um, they were told that the amount should be in blinking. I think it was supposed to be in blinking red. Huh, well, it certainly got the operator's attention. So, are there people who do it? Yeah, I think there are. Um, it, you got to do it very sparingly, right? Um, so again, they show us here on 22, whereas what they consider to be good design uses these highlighting techniques. Okay? And I really like that. One of the things I really like are these parentheses around negative amounts. That's sort of an accountant way of it's sort of accountant notation. It's very easy to miss the minus sign. Um, what some people would do would be say to use the minus sign and make the amount red. Of course, then you run into problems with people being red, green, colorblind, and all kinds of accessibility issues. I like the parentheses. Again, they've got some tips here about color or not color. Um, these are things that we discuss in a couple of places at SOAS, so we're not going to put a lot of time onto this. And they talk about the problems with color. And on this particular slide, they're not talking about accessibility issues. I think we might eventually talk about those. There are people who are colorblind, and there are different kinds of color blindness. So if we rely too much on color, we're going to decrease our accessibility. And they've got some pretty specific guidelines on layout and typography here that are pretty good. Okay. Um, for the most part, I agree with them. Okay. Could you have learned something in one of your classes that contradicted what what the Hoffer guys have to say? Yeah, that's possible. Would I go with the other class before Hoffer? Yeah, I probably would. Okay. Hoffer is a little old school here. Again, here's a text display that's not appealing on 26. And here's the same information on 27 in a much more appealing layout. Okay, so in terms of what you're going to be doing for this course, we're going to expect you to have an appealing layout. All right, why? Well, because we've been training you to do that for a number of years, and that's what we want. Again, here are some more tips about labels, not inconsistent with what we've been teaching. Formatting column and rows of text, sort in a meaningful order, place a blank line every 5 rows in long columns. I mean, there are a lot of kind of interesting tips here that they believe in. Okay, you might believe in too, or you may have some other ways to get the same effect. All right, but the reason why I think it's important is that you ought to be purposeful in your design. Here are some more tips. Right justify numeric data and align columns. Left justify textual data. Break long sequences of alphanumeric data into small groups of 3 or 4 characters. These are all things you've seen people do. Not a lot of times, perhaps you haven't thought about why, but they all seem like to be pretty good recommendations. So here's again where this is the bad version of a form where they don't like that they don't have column labels and they have a single column for all types of data, and the numeric data aren't justified. Right, and then we come back to the good version, the improved version, where they have fixed those problems. Again, I think this is probably a Visual Basic output and not a web output, but the web version wouldn't be much different. Okay. So they're recommending using tables and graphs when you can, and of course, tables are especially friendly to web content. right? And it's very easy to create an HTML table. Somewhat harder to do graphs in HTML, but possible. So they say use tables for reading individual data value, use graphs for providing a quick summary, displaying trends over time, comparing points and patterns, reporting large quantities of information. So you ought to consider tables and graphs. And here we're seeing where a little bit of professional typography in terms of having things outlined, having some kind of frame that goes around the data makes it a lot easier to read. And I would agree. This is pretty easy to do with spreadsheet applications, and that's one of the things I think that people, one of the reasons why they keep trying to use spreadsheets, because they do like the quality of the output that they get from it. Nothing to keep us from creating these kinds of outputs in really any kind of application. Again, here are some graphs. Okay, and some, there are some ways to do graphs on the web. You may have actually learned some, but graphs are kind of challenging to HTML, but not impossible. So on slide 36, we really start talking about usability, and I think an interesting way, because before we get here, we're really talking about largely visual aesthetic things. So you could really look at those things and say, well, one design is good and the other's bad. And why is that? Well, because one is visually pleasing and the other is not visually pleasing. One is easier to find data, the other one is harder. But in the real world, things are more challenging than that. Okay? I once thought that designs were either good or bad. And whether they were good or bad had to do with A, whether they were visually pleasing or not, and B, whether they were just very easy to follow. So I thought that a good design would be very easy to follow. Even if you weren't very experienced with it, you would be able to find all the data. So I would do designs that were visually pleasing, and we had a lot of jumps to, say, separate pages where you saw things clearly identified with a lot of room around them and all that kind of stuff. And I was always very upset that users would say to me, I don't like that. What I want is I want everything on one page because I use this all day long and I don't want to be going to too many places. And I said, well, that's not going to be good design. That's not going to be visually pleasing. And they said, I don't care. I don't care about visually pleasing. I'm a heads down everyday user, and I want to get the maximum use out of the real estate on my screen. Well, that would always make me sad. And it was, well, people like bad design. Well, the goodness of a design from a usability perspective really has to do with the nature of the user and how they're using it and what their sensibilities are. So, whereas visually pleasing and easily read were appealing to me, to heads down every day, all day users of an application, they took too much time, right? So what we really do is we need to ask ourselves, what are our users doing? And what are they looking at? And three of the characteristics that they talk about here on 36 are speed, accuracy, and satisfaction. Okay, and of course the satisfaction is going to have to do with the nature of your job. Now, I'm just going to say, because of the approach that we've taken to systems analysis, we are blessed with knowing not only who our users are, but what job they're currently doing. because you're designing inputs, outputs, or input outputs for a particular use case. You know who the actors are. You know what they're going to be doing. Okay? So, generally speaking, people like things to be very easy to follow if they're infrequent users. They want things to be more condensed and somewhat more challenging to follow if they're everyday heads down kind of users. So, who you're designing for and what their needs are is going to drive your design. There are no absolute aesthetic truths here. Okay? And the blessing that we have again is that we did use cases. So we're not designing this stuff and kind of saying, well, I wonder if anybody's going to use it. No, we know who's going to use it. We know when they're going to use it, and we know what they're going to use it for. So we should be in a great position to design things that are just what they need. And among other things, we know who to talk to when we want to know what they really think about it, right? So we can do a prototype and we can say, can we show this to a person who's going to be doing the use case and see what they think? And they might say, oh, this is pretty, Kevin, but it's a little too slow. Okay, I would get that a lot. And then I came to understand why. Okay, you cannot design inputs and outputs and input outputs without regard to who's going to be using them when, in what way. It's their use, it's their suitability for that use that makes them good or bad. It's not some artistic thing. Okay, let's go down. So that's consistent with the definition of usability that's on 37. Okay. Supporting a particular user for a particular task. Well, aren't you in great shape that we used use cases? Okay. Usability success factors, consistency, efficiency, ease, format, flexibility. There are some general things that people like. Okay. Characteristics for consideration. The user themselves, their experience, their skills, their motivation, the task that they're doing, the platform that they're on, so what kinds of inputs and outputs are possible on that platform, and the environment, maybe social and physical issues. Social and physical issues might be, well, for instance, do you need to design something so that somebody who's riding on, who's in an airplane seat on a laptop can work with your application without the people right next to them seeing all the confidential data of your company? That's environmental. Measures of usability that we might want to concern: how long is it going to take to learn, speed of performance, rate of errors, retention over time, subjective satisfaction, consistency of layout. So the thing that I want to sensitize you to is, in addition to how much of the day people use an application, okay, another grouping, another way to look at this is how frequently, in terms of from day to day or week to week or month to month, do people use things. If people only use things occasionally, they're actually kind of relearning it every time they go back. So we need to sacrifice maybe the quickness of something. If we have a really dense design, it can be very quick to use for expert users, but maybe this is an activity that people do only infrequently, in which case we probably need some kind of sparser presentation that is very easy to see how it works by looking at it. So maybe in terms of how many things you have to click on, it's kind of inefficient. But of course, it helps you along because you don't use it often and you often forget. Um, we want consistency of information within our application. Um, this is something we've just simply come to expect. People with their cell phones and their tablets are used to applications that all have a similar look and feel, and they're looking for, all the screens within an application to have a similar organization. That's just what we expect. Now, people didn't always get that, but they expect it now, and you better deliver. And then we've got some things that have to do with Pine Valley furniture, and that's uh, it for Pine Valley furniture. Template based HTML, well, they're talking about um, using templates for pages. There are templating features in HTML itself. There are templating features in a lot of the web serving uh, platforms. Clearly, you can keep a consistent presentation through using things like CSS. So there are a lot of technical ways to get this kind of consistent look and feel that we're talking about. And now we're down to the summary. So, again, here, maybe a couple of ideas that are not common to courses that you've already had, but generally speaking, you can have the confidence to use the good design principle that you've learned in your other classes when you go to create the four inputs and outputs that are going to be the that are going to be part of your proposed solution. And this semester, when we're doing the skills practice for this, I think we're only doing one. We used to do two. I think we're only going to do one. So one for the skills practice, and then four for the proposed solution. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to take a little break here and come back and show you the next chapter and talk about how that might have an impact on what you do for user interface design. Back in a second. Hi. I said I'd be back in a second. So this is chapter 11, designing interfaces and dialogues. And this is another important aspect of these user interfaces. So whereas in chapter 10, we were talking about how each of the components worked on their own, right? Here in chapter 11, we're talking about how components interact with each other and how they form a dialogue with the user. Now, this really plays into our decision to base our way of expressing our requirements as use cases, because we have use cases, we have these use case scenarios that the most trivial of which is just the basic flow, okay, and the more complex one is a combination of the basic flow and some alternative flows, okay, and they are written as a narrative, okay, and our instructions on how to create them have been make them be back and forth like a ping pong or a tennis game. And what is a dialogue like? Well, that's what dialogues are. One person says something, another person says something. So when we're talking about interfaces and dialogues, we're talking about things that are pretty well adapted to what we've done to capture the requirements based on use cases. Not going to go over the learning objectives. Again, when we're doing this user interface design activity, and we're concentrating on the dialogue part. Okay. Well, we want people to be able to see how the current screenshot that they're looking at, how that integrates into a larger dialogue. Okay, so in terms of the deliverables I'm asking you to create, somebody would look at the mock-up that you're going to do, and then they would have to look back to the use case specification to see how this mock-up fit into the flow of action in a use case scenario. Okay? When you're trying to design these things, well, some kind of a prototyping approach works. Now, either it's actually building a prototype and showing it to somebody. They can say, oh, I'll run this. I'll see how this runs. Or we write it down. We create use case specs and we create screen or report mock-ups. And then we kind of say, okay, now let's take a look at this together and walk through it together. And then you tell me if you see this working for you. Well, that's a more homegrown kind of a prototype, but it is a prototyping, iterative kind of approach. We're still in the design phase. Again, what we're doing in our class is we're doing a preliminary version of the design. We want the users to know what this thing's going to look like so that they're hooked on it, so that they're going to want to buy. Okay, we want them to get a peek at the new car. We want them to see the brochure. We want them to see the website. If we were doing a whole design, we would create a big document called the design specification. Okay, and parts of it would maybe include, in addition to mock-ups of the individual inputs and outputs, there might be some kind of a way to show the design of the conversation and how we moved from screen to screen. In our projects, in our class, we're going to leave the flows in the use case specification as the place to go to see how we flow through the narrative, and we're just going to create mock-ups for the inputs, outputs, or input outputs. So they talk about these specifications, okay? So this approach that the authors are taking, where they're having you write a narrative overview for the dialogue and all this kind of stuff as part of the design, this is in a way restating the narrative that would be in the use case specification. I would say that a lot of people today who have this kind of object-oriented orientation with tools would probably be saying that we probably would not want to restate the flow in a second time. We would probably want to be working off of the use case specification instead of restating it again here. Every time we restate information, we run the risk of having it be contradictory. I think you know what an interface is. So all computer interfaces must have an interaction style and use some hardware devices. Generally speaking, most systems these days are web-based. They use a browser, okay? Not all of them do, but most of them do. They have a particular interaction style that goes with that. Mobile apps that give a richer user interface than you get in the browser. Most of them, at least on whatever platform that you're on, have a particular look and feel and style that people expect for the iPhone or for Android. And so those are going to have their own interaction style. Now, the choices are really broad. Okay, I've told you in terms of picking your platform, you probably want to begin with a multi user, multi location application using the LAMP stack. Well, that means you're probably going to wind up with a web app or a mobile app with a web backend. Okay. But you could have an application that has command line interactions. Okay. It's kind of old school, but you could. Okay. You could have something that's menu based. You could have something that's form based. You could have something that's object based. Those are more graphical user interfaces. So most of the browser based applications that we have are maybe a hybrid of object based, form based, and menu based. The two that you don't see a lot are command line and natural language, although natural language is coming along. So in command line interaction, you get a prompt and you have to type in the command. This is a user interface that's very old. It was one of the first, it was the first online computer interaction paradigm. The good things is that if you're fast at typing and that you're good at remembering all of the commands and all the capabilities, you can be blindingly fast. So these days, the people who prefer command line interfaces are typically technically oriented experts. There's a guy down at the iSchool at the University of Illinois who's kind of the head of the tech folks, and he's got just an amazing ability to type at the command line. I, unbelievably fast, and that's what he prefers to do. That's how he does most of the things that he does because he is an expert. So for the most part, the people who prefer this kind of command line interface are experts. They're not beginners or intermediates. Okay. We use a lot of menus, right, where we make a series of choices that go down a decision tree. We have menus that are part of all the windowing systems. We typically have them across the top. We also have, as we go from page to page to page within a web application, kind of a menu kind of thing. You can pick from one list and then from a sublist and then from a sublist and those kinds of things. So menu interaction is popular. It's been popular for some time. It's very appealing to beginners because they like to see what all the possible options are. So it's much easier for them to understand the user interface or to understand the application when they can see all of its capabilities manifest in the menu. Okay? It's a little slower than some other approaches. Okay, another approach that's an alternative to menus are things like toolbar icons. Okay, toolbar icons are faster. They're generally preferred over menus by intermediates. Um, Once you know what all the symbols are and where they are, you can get to them faster than you can from a menu chain. But they're a little harder on beginners. Um, One of the interesting things is that if you think of some of the products that we use on the desktop, word processors, uh, things like Microsoft Word, Adobe Photoshop, those kinds of things, they typically have uh, they typically have a way to do things at the command line. Although you don't often do things at the command line, but for real experts, they have some batch things that they can do at the command line. They typically have things that you can do from the menu. They typically have things that you can do from with the graphical capability, and they have some things that you can do from the toolbar. Okay, so they have something for everybody. Um, they have some things for beginners, some things for experts, some things for intermediates. Now, when you go to design your system, you're probably going to have a narrower group of users. You're probably going to have a group of users who, if it's a dedicated application for your organization that people are going to use all the time, well, you could give the people some training and then they would be experts, right? Especially if they use it every day. Okay, or this might be the kind of thing for an occasional user. So your choice of what interaction method you're going to use is going to have to do with how frequently it gets used, like throughout the calendar period. It's going to do with whether your experts are beginners, intermediates, or experts. And it's going to do with whether they use it all day long or just occasionally throughout the day. Okay, and so your choice of some kind of interaction style or uh, paradigm is going to be based upon those needs. It's not all, it's not, uh, again, it's not absolute, it's user based. Okay? There's a lot of people who like graphical user interfaces and hate command line interfaces. Well, that has to do with their particular sensibilities. There are a lot of people who are the other way around. It depends on their sensibilities. So it's a combination of the kind of work that's being done and the sensibilities of the person doing it. Okay? And what you want to do is to figure um, how many means of interaction your application is going to have. There aren't a lot of us who create custom applications that have um, as many interaction style options as, say, Photoshop and Word do. So you're probably going to have to pick and choose a little more sparingly. There's a couple of slides here where we talk about more detail about how menus work. Again, I think we've covered that in other classes, and I don't have a lot to add there. Um, I think they say generally sensible stuff in this chapter. Um, let's see. What else have we got to say? Um, Now we've got some comments on forms interaction. Again, most of our forms these days are web forms or they're mobile app forms. Okay, so there are some general things that make sense for forms, right? Generally, the idea is that we're filling in the blanks and then we're saying, okay, process it. Okay, so here's a web form on slide 18. Um, they talk about object-based interaction here. So this is the graphical user interface. So this really includes a lot of things. Typically things that work with a mouse or other pointing device, things like drag and drop and those kinds of things, and highlighting and right clicking and all that kind of stuff. And then we have icons. So we have, again, the toolbar can be uh, a pretty popular means of accessing functionality, especially for intermediate users. Natural language interaction is the one that has, I think, come the farthest over the lifetime of this textbook. Now, this textbook where we're using the seventh edition, the eighth edition is out, but not in wide distribution. We might to it in a semester or two. And I don't know what they say about natural language interaction in the eighth, but in the seventh, they're really talking about this as a technology that hasn't quite isn't robust enough for use. Current implementations are tedious and difficult to work with, not as viable as other interaction methods. Well, think of digital assistants like the iPhone one is called Siri. Um, they're getting pretty darn capable, right? And I don't know, I don't remember what the um, I don't remember what the Android one is. In the advertisements, they say Google, tell me this or that. So maybe they simply call it Google. But in any case, the ability to either speak or type a question and get an answer back, where the question isn't just plain old natural language, which for most of us is English, but it can work in other languages too. The extent to which these kinds of interfaces are catching on and being useful is really increasing at a rapid rate. So this idea that you might not want to consider it because it's not ready for prime time, I think that's a little bit out of date. I think we may be pretty close to the heyday of the natural language uh, interaction. I mean, this really in the beginning of the time where this is getting good traction, and it should only be going up from here. Um, Here's a list of potential devices that you could use. Uh, Again, I think the point that we like to make about them, it's not that some are good and the others bad. Some are new and others are old, and we keep getting new versions of things. But the question is, how well adapted are they to the job at hand and to the sensibilities of your individual user? That's what we want to be talking about. They talk about some considerations here when you're choosing between these things like um visual blocking, user fatigue, movement scaling, durability. I mean, these are all things that you need to consider. And again, the beautiful thing for you is that we did use cases. We know who the users are. We know what they're doing. Okay? So it's going to be much easier for us to choose from the possibilities because it's not really a blue sky kind of a question. We have a rich context in which to make our decision. Here are some things that are different between the kinds of devices, things like adequate feedback, speed, pointing accuracy. Pointing accuracy is interesting for me. I have a trackball. I even have a portable trackball that I take around and I use with my MacBook Pro when I'm when I'm scrolling the screen here, I'm just using the touchpad in two of my fingers. But when I really want to point to something like this, I tend to use my trackball, which I really like. So again, um, a lot of these things have to do with the sensibilities of even individual users. And they've got some kind of interesting table here to compare different kinds of hardware and their different capabilities. Okay. Uh, Again, what's kind of interesting here is that we break back into form design, which we've already covered. So I'm not going to put a lot of time into that. They're showing us Pine Valley furniture forms. Um, One thing that they do mention here that I don't think they mentioned in the previous chapter is this idea that we believe in the U.S. that people navigate visually using left to right, top to bottom navigation. Now, that's true in the US because that's how we read our English prose text. People have kind of been trained to do that, and it's probably true that if you organize your screens that way, that people in the US who have average experience will do well at those designs. Um, there's there is they have some tips here that I think are worth noting. Free movement between fields. You know, the days where you have to fill out fields in a form in a certain order, well, that ship has long sailed. People don't want to do that. No permanent data storage until the user requests. That's pretty much a standard set of expectations. One of the things, sorry about that, I'm going to pause here till the phone stops ringing. I am visiting at my aunt's house over Thanksgiving weekend, and apparently there's a phone in the room where I'm doing my recording. Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, people want to be able to go from field to field. Um, People typically, especially with mobile apps, they would like to be able to find out wherever you've displayed something. They would like to be able to touch it and then change it. Okay, now whether that takes you to another screen very quickly, in which you can change it on the other screen and then come back, or whether you can actually change it in place, well, as long as it's not a lot of work, that they like it. But they don't like this idea that you've got one way to display data and another way to change it. They don't want you to change the data until they tell you to. Um, and the other thing is that a lot of times with these web forms, you'll see um, the ability to go, if you have a real long dialogue where you're going to fill in a long form, typically they will break it up into pages. And so as you move from page to page, the server will find a way to keep track of all the data that you have until you're ready to say, okay, submit the application. All right. So a lot of your applications are going to have that capability of having multi-page forms. Okay. And yet not committing the changes to the database until they're all done and you are happy with all of them. So that takes some interesting capabilities. There's some good comments in here about how to structure data entry that I like. Um, Generally speaking, the old days in which we allowed the user to give us any kind of input and then we screamed at them, those days are over. Okay, users rebelled. Okay, so typically what people want is that they want you to give them an option to choose among valid entries. So if there's only three things that you can enter, well, only give them three things to enter. If there's a range that's valid, then only give them the ability to enter that range. If you have some kind of slider, that might be a great way to do that. Um, uh, Sometimes you want to see some default or suggested text. Whatever you can do to have the application help the user instead of um, just complain when the user does something wrong, it's going to be time well spent. Um, on slide number 32, they the last thing that they talk about, this transposing, this is pretty interesting. Uh, One of the things that a common error in data input, especially when you're using a keyboard, is to um, transpose two letters or numbers. Um, One of the tricks that I learned long ago that you don't see very much anymore, and I don't remember whether they mentioned it in the text, is that if you are entering a number and you transpose two of the digits, you're typically off by nine, okay, in the place where you do it. It's typically a difference that's divisible by nine. I remember one application when things didn't balance out, we went and checked and said, were they off by nine? And we suggested to them that they had transposed some digits. It's, well, it's a little uh, old school wisdom. Um, Here's again another table from the book. A lot of good stuff here. Again, not real different from stuff we've learned in other classes, so I'm not going to put a lot of lecture time into it, but worth reading through. Um, it's pretty interesting to talk about feedback styles, okay? Again, there was an old school kind of a feedback style, and it kind of worked like this. The user would be working along, okay, and then the application would find something wrong, and they would pop up some kind of dialog box that says, you've made a mistake, or something bad is happening, and I want you to say yes or no, or accept or reject, or, whatever. Well, most people got angry at that kind of stuff. It had a couple of problems. One of the things is that they sometimes would tell you things that you knew nothing about how to fix. Okay, so instead of just making some assumption that the application would know better how to handle than you, they would put the decision on your shoulders. Two is they'd stop the show. They'd pop up one of these modal dialog boxes, and you would have to clear it before you were able to move on. So that modal feedback that takes over the user interface, it's very much kind of old school these days. We don't want to do that. Um, what do we want to do instead? Well, um, what we want to do is we want to give cues to the user when we find problems, but we don't want to interrupt them if they don't want to be interrupted. And I think the application style that works really well with this is is, is spelling and grammar checking in Microsoft Word. Okay, if it doesn't like your spelling, it'll give you a red underline. If it doesn't like your grammar, it'll give you a green underline. You can keep going. You can keep typing all you want. Okay, but it's giving you feedback about the status of the data without interrupting your work, but giving you enough information to catch your attention. That kind of style is contemporary. Okay? This thing where you pop up a dialog box and say, you misspelled that, or you typed the same word twice, that is very frustrating and very old school. Help. Um, the question is, what kind of help are you going to have for your application? And there are all kinds of help. Okay, you'll see in some applications what they've done is they've just taken the user manual and they found a way to navigate it and search in it. In other applications, you'll find kind of what they call context sensitive help, where it depends on the page that you're on. But what you'll see is it will pop up help that relates to what you're currently doing. That's quite nice. So you really have to think about what kind of help you're going to provide for your application. So here on slide number 36, here are some different options that you could pick. And they look pretty good. Okay. Uh, Interesting. Help on help. This is a classic help question. Okay. Um, a lot of times, what people do in command line environments is if you type help, what you will get is help on help. Okay. So you'll see, how do I get help? You'll get the answer to that. And that will teach you how to do help on all these other things. Uh, Dialogues are, again, this ping pong um, oriented kind of back and forth that go on between users and systems. And we've been really cultivating a style throughout the course. And so um, what we're talking about here in terms of designing a dialogue is really designing something consistent with that good back and forth style that we've talked about. Um, uh, Here we have a typical dialogue between user and customer information system. Again, this kind of looks like the kind of dialogue that we would see in a basic flow of a use case specification. Okay, so we're really working on our dialogue design there. Um, Again, they've got some ideas that we might want to think about, right? Consistency, shortcuts, feedback, closure, reversal. Reversal is one really interesting thing, okay? You don't see this a whole lot in the custom application systems, but you do see a lot in our desktop applications. This undo capability is very, very important to people. Um, a lot of times, you'll find that some of the bad interaction design comes from an inability to reverse things. Like, I'll tell you, um, there's one application I use a lot, the Eclipse a development environment or IDE for Java programming. And when you go to leave Eclipse, you click on the button to close Eclipse. It will ask you, do you want to leave Eclipse? Well, didn't I just tell you I wanted to leave Eclipse? Well, one of the reasons that they asked you that is in the old days because Eclipse is a Java application and Java is slow at starting up. It used to be a lot slower. And of course, processors are much more capable than they were before. So it used to be that when you started up Eclipse, it might take 3 minutes or 4 or 5. Well, if you accidentally closed it, that would be a real heartbreak because then you would lose 3 minutes or 4 or 5. So they said, the problem with that, that outcome is so bad that we better warn them before we actually close it. You have the same problem when you go to delete something. They say, do you really want to delete it? Well, just delete it. Okay, what people have done is that they've created like trash baskets. So you can go to places and undelete things. So the ability to reverse things gives you the ability to have your user interface be less kind of crapped up by this mother may I stuff where you want to close something. Do you really want to close it? You want to delete something? Do you really want to delete it? What did I say? Read my lips. Close it. Okay? And one of the interesting things is the ability to reverse the effects of whatever you did without losing data. Um, a lot of times will allow the user interface to be more friendly to what the user actually asks you to do, closing, deleting, etc. Um, they show us an approach that we're not really going to use in our course, but is interesting, and I've left it in here because it's something that you might want to use somewhere down the line. You can take every dialogue that you create, which is, again, we really document our dialogues in our use case specifications. But you can take each of them, and you can have a, a there's a graphical approach to doing it. So there's a dialogue sequence diagram, and they're based upon these kind of boxes. And you come down here, and let's see if we have one here. Yeah, you can see where you can go from each one. Now, isn't something that I personally use. I know a lot of people do, but these kind of diagrams can be a great way to explain how you get around the system without having to read all the detail of the narratives in the use case uh, specification. Building prototypes and assessing usability. In the usability that we teach in iSchools, we definitely talk doing good design, right? And doing prototypes and all those kinds of things. But one of the things that is a very important part of usability is this idea that we're going to test it out. We're going to take the user interface. It's a certain point before we install the system, and we're going to test it on a group of test subjects and get some feedback. Is it really as usable as we thought it was going to be, or have we done some things that we're just blind to? Okay, so doing some usability testing and then perhaps making some changes as a result of what we see there is very positive stuff. Um, uh, what's really interesting here is we're talking about graphical interface design issues. And most of the people in my classes these days sort of grew up on graphical interfaces. That wasn't true of me and my colleagues because graphical interfaces came in about the middle of our careers. But again, the kind of things that we've been talking about in our courses throughout your program at SOAS, these are things that promote a good GUI design. And then we get into Pine Valley again. Oh, here's the thing that they talk about in the middle of a Pine Valley. This idea that um, well, this isn't what I thought it was. But so let me talk about what I thought I was going to talk about, which is how many times you have to click to get something done, right? You know, there are some people who say that when you go to a website and you want to get to something, you should be able to get there in 3 clicks, right. Well, is it three? Is it five? Is it two? Is it one? You ought to be mindful of how much navigation has to go on to get the job done. And again, there's no absolute truth to this. Um, uh, People who are frequent all day users of an application probably will put up with more aggregated information that's not so visually pleasing because they don't have to navigate as often. Okay? So they don't want to have to go too many places to get their work done. People who don't use it all day, and especially people who use it only infrequently, they probably wouldn't mind so much having to click so many times to go to a special place in which what they want to do is very easy to do. Um, this is, for the most part, not what I want to talk about. Okay, so we come to the summary, and that's it. Okay, so this has you at the point where you're going to be doing two things. One is you're going to be doing the skills practice for um, user interface design, and then um, later on, when you're doing your project, you're going to be doing the four mock-ups that go into the proposed solution. And the standards for these things are all going to be the same. We're looking for a mock-up of an input and output, or in the modern day, an input-output. Okay, we want them to be recognizably part of one of your use cases. Okay, it should be a snapshot in time of one of your use cases. Okay, we want them to have lots of sample data. We don't want empty fields. We want this to look like you took a picture of a screen in the middle of a real user using the application. And the more data you can put into your mock-up such that a user can infer what the situation is and what's possible to do, the better. We're looking for a rich learning experience for the user. Okay? Um, what tool you use to do this is really up to you. I have um, a tutorial that I've done in the past where I show people how to mock something up uh, with Excel. You know, you could use Excel, you can use Word. I've had a lot of good luck with just HTML and CSS. There are mock-up tools. I had a person who worked for me down at Illinois who had been doing web design for a long time, and she was very good with Adobe InDesign. Now, Adobe InDesign is a very elaborate product. This tool worked for her for mockups because she was an expert at it. And she had me using it for a while too. So what you got to do is you have to figure some kind of a mock-up tool and do a mock-up for a particular point in time in one of your dialogues, not one of your dialogues, one of your use cases, not the administrative ones, not login or authorized users, but part of your business use cases. And what we're looking for is four snapshots from four different places where we don't want the same. We don't want four subsequent shots from the same point in one of your use cases. We want you to show us four different uh, scenarios that you're in. Okay. We want a lot of sample data, and of course, we want you to pay attention to all the good design things that you learned throughout your career at SOAS, and pay attention to some of the tips and tricks that were in the last couple chapters. So, having said that, I think you're ready to work on your work. So I'm going to say bye until next time. Bye bye.